Okay, hello, welcome everybody to our session today. It's very exciting to be here with you and to present our talks here today on creativity and associative thinking, neural and cognitive explorations into the creative mind. And before we get started with the research talks today, I just want to give everyone a sense of what we mean by associative thinking. And by doing that, we'll just kind of start off with a quick exercise. You can kind of play along in your seats or at home. So when you think about creativity, just think about what's the first word that pops into your mind. So some people might associate creativity with arts, or paintings, or famous visual artists over the years. Other people might associate creativity with music or music improvisation. And others might associate it with imagination or spontaneous thinking or many other things you could possibly associate to the word creativity. And this simple exercise just kind of demonstrates the phenomenon of associative thinking and how we can kind of differ in the associations that we make. And so in our talks today, we'll be exploring associative thinking and its relevance to creativity. And I'll get us started with a talk on associative thinking in creative experts, so artists and scientists. And then Dr. Emmanuel Vallée will talk about neurocognitive mechanisms of combining remote semantic associates and how that relates to creativity. And then Dr. Caroline DeBardi-Luft will talk about oscillatory brain mechanisms of semantic associations. And then finally, Dr. Yoav Kennett will talk about how the way that we search our memory relates to creativity. Okay, and if you have any questions today, please feel free to check out the Slido. There's a QR code right here. And you can participate in the discussion by upvoting the different questions that are populated on the Slido. Okay, so to get us started, as I mentioned, my talk today is about creative experts and the role of creative associative thinking in creative expertise. And just to kind of get started with a little bit of background on the theories, cognitive theories of creativity and associative thinking. One of the theories that has been around for a very long time is the associative theory of creativity. And this theory essentially posits that creative thinking involves combining remote concepts in memory. So things that are kind of unrelated or distantly related, creative thinking involves kind of bringing those things together. And that people differ in their ability to make these associations because they kind of differ in how strongly they associate these things together in memory. And so this is kind of an individual differences way of thinking about what makes some people more creative than others. And as I already mentioned earlier, and with our exercise in the beginning, we talked about free association, so that what's the first word that pops into your mind when you think about something. And of course, this is one of the oldest topics in psychology that goes back to Freud and William James and others that were interested in getting insight into the nature of the unconscious mind. And more recently, cognitive psychologists have been interested in using free association data to get insight into the structure of memory and how we go about accessing concepts in memory. And so you can kind of contrast free association, where kind of anything goes, whatever pops into your head is kind of a valid response, to what I'm going to talk about as goal-directed association. And that is where you're trying to retrieve specific information from memory, and accuracy really counts more here. So I have a picture of the kind of classic intelligence model. And one of those facets is broad retrieval ability, and that's verbal fluency. So many people might be familiar with verbal fluency tasks where you have to, for example, think of as many words as you can or list as many words as you can in a minute. So as many animals as you can or as many synonyms as you can. But again, accuracy really matters for this form of association. Okay, and so when we're talking about associative thinking and how all of this is working in the mind, we want to make a distinction between the organization or the structure of memory and the retrieval processes that are kind of operating in that space. And this is a beautiful figure that was from the Dr. Vallée in one of her book chapters, where she talked about different ways of kind of navigating through semantic memory. So On the left-hand side, I believe, or at least on my screen, we have somebody who is starting at one place in a semantic space where the stimulus is, and you can think about these as different words. And they're kind of going from that one stimulus location to another remote part of this semantic network, which is the one that has the red circle. And the way they're getting there is through more controlled ways of kind of navigating through semantic space, kind of inhibiting certain concepts, strategically searching around. And on the other hand, you have the B panel here, which is someone who has more links in their semantic network. And so they're able to kind of get to the same spot, that target circle in the diagram here, through more kind of passive spreading activation type processes. So basically this just kind of shows that we have some kind of structure of memory, and there's different processes that could be operating within that structure in order to make associations. Okay, so now to kind of get to the core of my talk today, which is to look at whether creative experts differ in the kinds of associations that they make. So I'm going to be talking about artists and scientists in particular, and the role of associative thinking in a kind of higher level creative expertise. And this project was led by a graduate student in my lab, Hannah Merciel. And we were fortunate to get access to what's called the Big C project. So this is a large data set of kind of renowned artists and scientists, so Guggenheim and MacArthur awardees and highly cited scientists, and what we're calling a SMART comparison group, which is a group of individuals who are matched on their general cognitive ability, so their fluid intelligence. And so we had roughly 30 to 40 people in these different categories, and they completed a wide range of tasks and questionnaires and brain scanning, which I will not cover here today. We just kind of focused on word association. And so people in the study were presented with several different words, and they completed 3 conditions. So in one condition, it was free association, like we did earlier, just kind of whatever pops into your head. And then there were 2 other conditions, which I was characterizing as goal-directed. So one is where you're coming up with a common association, like what's the most common thing you could say about this concept. Another one is uncommon association. So what's a kind of remotely associated word to this concept? And I'll just kind of give it an example here. So if you're given the word green, you might freely associate the word grass, maybe because of based on a recent experience you had that made you think about grass. In these goal-directed association conditions, in contrast, you have the common association, where you're thinking of something that's the most common thing you can think of to this concept, which might be color. And uncommon could be something like taste. For example, if you're thinking about a food that might be green. Okay, so just kind of showing these different conditions and then kind of testing differences in performance. And the way we quantify performance here is through semantic distance. So this allowed us to put a number on the concepts that people came up with when they were freely associating. And if you ever heard of latent semantic analysis, this is a kind of a form of that. And it allows us to quantify word similarity based on distributional properties in natural language. So basically, how often words co-occur together. If you look at large collections of text, like encyclopedias and the internet, how often words are co-occurring together is a way of a proxy of getting a sense of how related they are. And words that co-occur less frequently would be more semantically distant. Okay, so looking at the conditions here, so just overall, before you look at creative expertise at all, were there differences in this common association, free association, and remote association, or uncommon, I should say? And this is indeed what we found was a kind of graded pattern from common association being the less distant, free association being in the middle, and uncommon association being the most distant. So kind of the uncommon association being as expected, and kind of interesting that the free association is between those two. But when it comes to creative expertise, so did the scientists and the artists differ in the kind of associations that they made? What we found, interestingly, was that artists, and I should say these are visual artists, these weren't people that had particular expertise with words, produced more distant associations than scientists and this SMART comparison group, but especially in the free association conditions. So when they were just freely associating, they came up with far more distant associations than the other groups. And the scientists, interestingly, had less distant associations than the control condition. However, I'm sure that doesn't apply to any of the scientists in the room here today. So now I want to wrap up here and just kind of give a quick shout out to the paper we published in Division 10's Journal Psychology of Aesthetics, Creativity, and the Arts. If you're interested in checking it out, you can scan the QR code and go directly to the paper. And with that, I just want to thank the students in my lab, Hannah and Simone, and my collaborator, Yoed Kennett, and Dr. Robert Bilder and Kendra Knudsen, who were involved in the Big C data collection. And thank you all for your attention. Okay, and next up, we will have Dr. Emmanuel Vallée.
Thank you, Roger, and thank you, Yoed, for organizing this symposium. I'm very happy to be here today to talk about creativity and associative thinking. So according to the associative theory, more creative people can form more remote semantic associations. They can connect more distant concepts. And Melnick designed this remote associate task to operationalize this theory. In this task, one has to find a common word combining 3 unrelated keywords. So in this example, the solution linking vivid, elephant, and labs is the word memory. So more creative people can better combine distant concepts and better solve this task because they have a different organization of semantic associations in their memory. Organization that can be revealed by the properties of their semantic networks. And for instance, Lucchini and colleagues including Yoed and Roger here, so they found that performance on the remote associate task relates to the properties of the semantic networks. And furthermore, with my colleagues, we found that the creative achievements in real life of the participants could be predicted from the properties of the individual semantic networks. So this work shows how the organization of semantic association in memory is a cognitive component of creativity. So then, to better understand how more creative people can connect more distant concepts, we developed an adaptation of the remote associate task in which we varied the semantic distance between the keywords and the solution. So based on this variable distance, we separated close and distant trials. So in distant trials, the solution is more distant. And in 2 samples, we found that more creative people, according to questionnaires, were better able to find more remote solutions. So next, we wonder whether people who can connect more distant concepts or better solve this task had more connected brains. And to address this question, we explored brain functional connectivity using a connectome-based predictive approach. And in fact, we were able to predict the scores from brain connectivity for both close and distant trials. So here you can see that the scores predicted from brain connectivity on the y-axis are significantly correlated with the real observed scores on the x-axis. And furthermore, we were able to identify different brain connectivity patterns predicting these close and distant trials. So for close trials, the performance was predicted from connectivity of the default mode network in orange with other networks, including the somatomotor network, the dorsal attention network, the science networks. For distant trials, the pattern was much richer, including the same connectivity of the default mode networks with other networks, but additionally involving connections of the executive control network with these other networks. So even though this task was initially designed to test the associative hypothesis, which is coherent with the dominant role of the default mode network connectivity, the involvement of these other networks suggests that other processes, more controlled processes, may be at play during this task, and especially when the solution is remote. Overall, these results are well in agreement with a series of functional connectivity studies that used different tasks, different creativity tasks than the remote associate task. And these studies kind of clarified two main brain networks for creative thinking. First, the default mode network that is classically involved in spontaneous cognition and memory. And second, the executive control network that is involved in cognitive control. So it appears that these two brain networks support the associative and the controlled processes underlying creative thinking. And in a lab focused on frontal lobe functions, we are the front lab, we were especially interested in the fact that the two main creativity networks involve distinct parts of the prefrontal cortex. So to better understand the critical role of these two networks and their frontal components, we tested patients who had a focal and unique lesion in the prefrontal cortex. And we used advanced lesion method to map deficits to lesion locations and to brain disconnections. To assess deficits, we used our adapted version of the remote associate task. And in addition, to better assess associative thinking, we used a simple word association task. So there were two conditions. In the first spontaneous or free condition, patients gave the first word that came to their mind in response to a keyword. In the second creative goal-directed condition, they were instructed to give a word that is unusually originally associated with a keyword. And then we measured how remote were the responses. So we found several results. First, patients with a lesion in the default mode network, and especially in this green medial prefrontal area, they had difficulties in generating remote associates in the word association task in both conditions. In addition, they were impaired in the remote associate task, which is not really surprising because in this task, the solution is a remote word from the keywords. So this suggests that the medial prefrontal cortex is critical for associative thinking in creativity. We found another region in the rostral and lateral part of the prefrontal cortex as part of the executive control network. So patients with a lesion in this area were also impaired in the remote associate task, but they had no difficulties at all to generate remote associates. So this suggests that, in contrast with the previous patients, these patients were not impaired in generating remote associates, but rather in combining associates. So these results suggest that the rostrolateral prefrontal cortex may be critical for creativity when a combination of associates is needed to meet the constraints of the task. Time to conclude. We recently replicated these results in another disease, in frontotemporal dementia, which is a neurodegenerative disease that predominantly affects the prefrontal cortex. And in this other group of patients, we also found the critical role of the medial prefrontal cortex for associative thinking, remote associations, and of the rostrolateral prefrontal cortex for combining associates. This time, the conclusion. So first, we can say that spontaneous semantic associations contribute to creativity because the way these associations are organized in an individual's memory will determine which ideas come to mind spontaneously. And this involves the default mode network. But spontaneous thinking is not always enough to be creative. And then a first level of control occurs to inhibit irrelevant ideas or guide the search in memory in a goal-directed manner. And this involves the executive control network that interacts with the defaultment network. And finally, another level of control occurs with the need to combine elements, to combine associates. And this in particular recruits the rostral part of the prefrontal cortex. I will stop here. I would like to warmly thank my team and collaborators for their wonderful work, and I thank you very much for your attention. And now I leave the mic to Caroline de Bernardi-Luft.
Hello, everyone. So today I'm going to talk about the brain oscillatory mechanisms of semantic associations that we've been talking about today. I will start by challenging you to find Wally, or Waldo for our fellow Americans and Canadians. So can you find him? I'm going to give you 5 seconds. Okay, I'm going to put you out of your misery. It took me 20 minutes, to be fair. Don't have time for this today. So there you are. It's on the left bottom corner. So you might be wondering, why is she asking us to find Wally in a talk about semantic associations and creativity? Well, the reason is that the same brain oscillatory patterns that are needed to find Wally successfully in this picture are also involved in creative thinking. And today I am going to talk about that. For example, to find Wally here, your brain has to really inhibit everything else that is behind it, all the clutter around this, to be able to focus and find Wally. So to do that, your brain has to produce synchronized activity of millions of neurons working together between 8 and 12 hertz, or cycles per second. That is alpha oscillatory activity. Alpha oscillatory activity is implicated in a number of different cognitive processes, from attention, working memory, learning, you name it. And it's being traditionally interpreted as inversely related to activation because of the early studies where when people close their eyes, you'd see alpha visibly increasing in the back of the brain where the visual cortex lies. So, however, more recently, studies in monitoring alpha oscillations in cognitive tasks have shown that these oscillatory patterns represent the active inhibition of task-irrelevant brain areas. So, for example, when you're trying to find Wally, your brain has to shape the axis of something that looks like Wally in the visual cortex, but also inhibit everything else around it to be able to find. And that's why it gets so hard the more clutter you have. Interestingly, these same alpha patterns are observed in creativity studies, and it has been consistently the case. So what I will do now, I will show you how this might work for creativity, how these processes are related. For concreteness, let's imagine you've been given a task to come up with a marketing campaign for a price comparison website. I know it's strange. So you'd be thinking about the semantic associations, as Roger and Emmanuel told you about. You might think comparison, competition, strength. You might associate that with price, money, and then you go to something else that is related to that. You might think of market, shopping, bargain, and there you go. And if you keep going along those lines, you might end up in a boring semantic space that you might feel like you were stuck. And at some point, you might have to inhibit all of this clutter on your semantic network to get to where you want to find. So you might think, okay, this is not getting me anywhere. Maybe I should think of a pun. Muskrat. Maybe I should associate that with a muskrat and come up with something that is Compare the Muskrat campaign. I think most people do not know what muskrat is, however cute they are. So let's think again. Let's inhibit that muskrat thing and try another pun. Market. Market sounds a bit like another animal. Meerkat. Oh, that's much better. They are so cute. And they do all sorts of things, which is perfect for a marketing campaign. So you might be thinking, oh, maybe you should come up with a Meerkat advisor that tells people where to find things that are cheaper. I'm sure you're familiar with that. If you're not, please do me a favor and Google Compare the Meerkat. You'll see what I'm talking about. It's a fabulous marketing campaign. But today I'm going to focus on how do we get to Meerkat by inhibiting everything else, because this is only possible if you do so. So we use the remote associate tasks, which Emmanuel talked about. It's just a slightly different version. So here you have to find a word that makes a compound word with each of these three words. Any takers? I don't have 20 minutes again, so I'm going to give you the answer. It's walk. Walkman, catwalk, sleepwalk. Who here thought of the word nap? Show your hand. Yeah, I can see some hands. That's great. So nap gets on the way, so you have to inhibit it to find the walk. How about keep your mind and show? So the solution here is game. In this case, you do not have a obvious obstruction to get over. So we compare these items. So the first type of items have a shared wrong association, whereas the second type of items do not. So you have to find without having to obviously inhibit something that gets on the way. So to solve the first class of problems, you need to inhibit those associations. And that's why we tested the potential mechanism of alpha oscillatory rhythms to inhibit this. Like, how important are they to inhibit? So we developed 4 experiments, and on the first one, we test the effects of stimulating alpha oscillatory rhythms on the right temporal lobe, which is associated with semantic associations. And we found that under stimulation, alpha stimulation on the right temporal lobe, the participants were more able to solve the problems with the shared wrong associations, the one that require people to get over those, compared to the other ones. So it didn't have any effect on the other problems. We looked into this with EEG as well to see whether these patterns were actually localized on the right temporal hemisphere. And here you have a demonstration in red are the problems with shared wrong association. So alpha power was higher on the right temporal lobe when people were correctly solving problems that require them to inhibit that semantic association. So we then tested this further and thought, okay, maybe just for this task, so how about an unusual users task where people have to come up with unusual uses for things like a brick? And we applied a similar stimulation protocol, and we observed that during the stimulation, people came up with ideas that were more remote, more far away from the usual use of the object. And then we repeated that again with EEG, looking at the right temporal lobe, and we observed that alpha oscillatory rhythms were higher on the right temporal lobe, when they were coming up with more remote ideas. So then we move on, and coming along the same lines that Roger and Emmanuel were talking about, we wonder, is this different for free semantic associations when people are not trying to be creative? So we monitor people's EEG when they are coming up with free associations. So in the figure you see in front of you is during the think times, just before they gave the association. And we observe, as you can see in the plot, that the power of the oscillatory activity in alpha range was much higher everywhere when people came up with associations that had higher semantic distance. So then we were a bit puzzled. So what is the role that alpha is playing in this case when there are spontaneous free associations? To elucidate that or to investigate this further, we looked into a second study in which we compare alpha oscillatory rhythms when people were just coming up with free associations versus when they were instructed to inhibit the first thing that comes to mind and give a more remote association with a cue. And here you go again, you can see on the left side that when people are coming up with more distant associations intentionally, they had a much stronger alpha oscillatory pattern than compared to non-intentional, and that this was higher for items that had higher semantic distance that are demonstrated in the red. We also found that when they had that, there was an increase in connectivity from the left to the right side of the brain where these semantic association areas are. So it looks that when people are coming up with remote ideas, they are actually top-down controlling that, directing the activity from the left, attentional areas. We don't have much precision with EEG, I'm sorry. You would need something like a fMRI for this, but you see that left parietal and frontal to the right anterior temporal, showing that it's a bit different when people are coming up intentionally with goal-directed associations. So I would like to finalize by making some remarks at the end. So alpha oscillation seems to work to creativity similarly to what they do for attention by suppressing what is preeminent but less useful for your goal of being creative. Inhibition is goal-directed in this case, and when the associations are spontaneous, creative links might rely on lower levels of neuroactivity, and that is spontaneous and goal-directed associations may rely on distinct neural mechanisms. So thank you very much. This is Marta. I don't know if you know about her. She's a Brazilian football player. I'm from Brazil. And she has scored more goals than any male football player, including Pelé and Neymar. I just thought I should let you know. Thank you. Now, thank you. Now I'm going to introduce you to Dr. Joerd Kenneth. He is going to give the last talk of our symposium. Thank you.
Oh, thanks. This is good. All right, thank you. It's great to be here, and we just heard 3 fantastic talks on how creativity relates to associative thinking and how more creative people are indeed more associative in their thinking. So I would like to talk a little bit about maybe flipping this relation and asking whether we can actually use the way people search their memory to predict anything about them, especially creativity. This really complex behavior, can we use tasks that allow us to search to represent how people search their memory, okay? And to do that, we're going to use a very simple task. It's called semantic fluency or verbal fluency, and in a minute or two, all you have to do is say all the animals you can think of, okay? I hope you will agree it's not a difficult task to do, and if you are now mentalizing yourself animal names, then a lot of the times people say dog, cat, mouse, etc. And then sometimes they will also say lions and tigers and bears, oh my, oh my, oh my. So there's a lot of regularity in how people are searching their memory and the types of animal names they're using. And recent computational research on this task have shown that we can represent it or operationalize it as a mental navigation task. And so this is a lot of work coming from physics and computer science that allows us to say, can we use this as a sort of representation of how people search their memory? But that brings a different type of challenge or question, which is, okay, can we or how can we represent memory to represent how people search on it? Okay, that's a whole different line of research. And I would like to talk about one specific model that is gaining popularity in how to study or represent our own mental lexicon or memory system, and that is through something that is called a multiplex or a multidimensional model of memory. And you see that on, well, to me it's on the left of my screen. And what we do is we have words or concepts and we represent their organization as networks across different types of information. And the top is based on associative or semantic information, then you have phonological layer, and you have these different types of layers, because the way our memory relates concepts to each other is based on different types of information together. Okay, so we're going to use this computational approach, and then we're going to represent how people search on this space, okay? One thing that is very unique about this model is that if you take all these different layers of information and you just mesh them together, you get what you see on the right of the screen, this sort of big cluster. And this cluster that we call the largest viable cluster is the largest amount of words in this model that relate to each other across all types of information, okay? And so when we do that, we find this sort of core in the model. And this core that we call the largest viable cluster has been shown to be related to very familiar, concrete, simple words that are learned early on in life, in child language acquisition. And what we're going to do is we're going to take the way people search their memory for animal names, and we're going to superimpose that on this lexicon, and we're going to mostly study whether they are inside this core or outside the core. We have all these measures that allow us to quantify the sort of the patterns of searching across this model, and especially the core versus the periphery. And then we're going to ask whether that allows us to predict how a person is creative or not. So in step one, or study one of a series of studies, this is exactly what we ask if we can. And this is based on data that Roger and I collected a while back ago. And we had groups of low creative folks and high creative folks also generate semantic fluency animal names. And what we wanted to do is to say, can we use this multiplex model and how people search their memory when generating animals to classify them into the a priori groups that we had of low creative and high creative, okay? So this is pretty much what we did. We first represented for each individual their features of how they search their memory over this model. Then we used a machine learning model to classify them. That you see at the bottom of the screen, very successfully, about 70% to low creative and 70% to high creative. So overall, as a first step, that signaled to us that we can actually use this model to represent people, classify them based on this specific model. Then we took a step forward, and part two of the student of mine who just finished, we wanted to go to a related capacity that strongly relates to creativity, which is openness to openness to experience, the personality trait that has been the most strongly related to creativity. And from a different data set that Roger collected, we had now a larger sample of people who underwent personality assessment. We're focusing on openness, and we wanted to replicate what we did with creativity and say, can we use this modeling approach to predict how a person, or classify how a person is low openness or high openness, but then also move a step forward and say, can we predict individual differences in openness score? So we're doing the exact same thing on a different sample with additional analysis. And what we find on the left, we very strongly are able to classify people into low openness or high openness. And also we found that we can actually very strongly predict individual differences in openness. So to sum up these two things, with 1 minute of saying animal names, we can very strongly predict how a person is creative and open. And then we took the last step in this series for now, and we wanted to go bigger, better, and elsewhere. And this is data that we recently collected, where we had now 500 subjects online do all these types of assessments that you see on the right: openness, creativity, self-reported creativity, and also the alternative uses task, and intelligence. And we want to do the exact same thing and ask, how well can we predict in general high-level cognition, classifying people into low versus high for each of these 4 dependent variables, or predict individual differences. And overall, again, we are extremely successful at about 90% accuracy of predicting if a person is in low or high, and also about 50 or 60% able to predict individual differences in across these 4 different but related complex behaviors. So overall, the way someone searches their memory is not just related to how they're creative, but it allows us to really strongly predict a lot of the most exciting things about a person. And it's maybe a little bit uncanny. All I need is 1 minute of you saying animal names to know pretty much all that is interesting about you, which I think is interesting, exciting, maybe alarming a little bit, and opens up a lot of different interesting research and applied directions. So thank you very much. And now, just to conclude our exciting session, so overall, we've heard 4 talks that I think all very excitingly highlight how much progress we've made studying the role of associative thinking creativity. That is a topic was not really studied till most recently, and it also demonstrates how the advancement and development of computational tools allow us to do that, because in practice, to be able to ask this question of what is the role of creativity in associative thinking, how can And we study that, we actually need to be able to look at constantly two things, which were alluded at across all the talks. The first is the structure of one's memory, and the second is the actual process of retrieving remote or close associations. And the rapid developments in computational tools from natural language processing and network science really have propelled our ability to study this. And in a recent paper that Roger and I wrote and was just published, we tried to provide a current review of all of these approaches and to really highlight how associative thinking is a general cognitive mechanism that relates to individual differences in creativity, and how the tools that have been developed allow us to move forward into understanding it. And that pretty much is it. For anyone who wants to ask questions, please use the Slido, and we'll be happy to have a panel discussion on all of this. Thank you. So I think someone...
I have a question from the audience,
Yes, please.
from Christina. It's for Dr. Beatty. Within the scientist and artist, did you explore neurodiversity differences? So whether people identified as neurodivergent versus neurotypical?
That is indeed an interesting question that we were not able to address in this particular study. It's possible that the data was available in this larger project I mentioned. It was from a kind of a larger scale data collection effort, but that's not something that we looked into. No.
Thank you. Tracy is asking, and not to somebody specific, in the research using semantic associations as measures for creativity, did all subjects have the same native language? And she continues with, were multilingual, ASL, etc. viewed?
So, anyone wants to...
I can think concretely in our study, it's an inclusion criteria that all the participants are native French speakers. We do the studies in French. I guess it's the same for other studies, but
So I think we
I would say
mostly...
it's critical.
Oh, sorry. I was just going to say that we usually control for that, but then this has been now shown in French, Chinese, English, Hebrew, Dutch, and so many different languages, and it all pretty much replicates. So it seems to be very robust, but yeah, we should always try to control for as many different factors: fluency, intelligence, prior vocabulary knowledge. There's all these things that are always potential confounds.
I think that's also a very interesting question because, for example, in my samples that I presented, we are in London and it's super multicultural. So there were a lot of participants who had English as their native language, but also were bilingual. They grew up speaking other languages. And I would be very interested in comparing their data. We just didn't get to do that, but it's a really interesting thing to look at, actually, whether the semantic associations of people who are, who actually are originally bilingual, how would that be different? Yeah, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Emily is asking, can we relate the findings to the Rorschach ink blot tests? So your findings, where one could predict higher levels of creativity based on both the number and the originality of the response?
Cool question.
Interesting question. Yeah, I mean, I think that's where a lot of free association comes from, right? I mean, is the psychoanalysts who are using free association to try to get insight into what's going on in people's unconscious minds. And I would say that there are actually some creativity tests that people often use that just kind of present ambiguous shapes and ask people to provide labels to them. And so that's kind of there's a parallel there where it's here's something, it could be anything, put a creative association, what pops into your head, or try to be creative and label this thing. I think there's some connections there that could be made. I don't know if anyone else has any thoughts on that. Yeah.
Yeah, I think there is one studied from 2008 that used the Rorschach test and measured how original the response were and did this in fMRI, and they found similar, in my memory at least, the regions that were involved during this task mirror what we now consider as the creativity networks.
Just a final point, I think this is also really interesting, because if you think about historically the free association task, the way it's used in the beginning was to test mental sanity of people, and if you said something too far, it was considered like it might have be considered insane, and I think
that's a link.
That is a very interesting link there.
Right.
Back to the basics we go, I guess.
Well, thank you. I think we have time for another question. Kate is wondering, are the studies equating creativity with the linguistic faculty? And if so, what other types of intelligence might be obscured?
So I think my interpretation of that is, are your kind of linguistic abilities tied up in some of these tests? And I would say to some extent, yes. If you have a larger vocabulary, for example, like you're going to have more, diverse words and more low-frequency words and so forth. And so that's why some people might just go towards more purely visual tasks that aren't tied up with vocabulary at all. But I mean, to the extent you could really tease those things apart, and even the visual tasks actually in our field often have like a linguistic component to them. Often, like I said earlier, like the test where you're presented with some ambiguous shape and you have to label it somehow, I mean, that requires words and knowledge of a bunch of different words. So I think that's challenging to do, and even if you're drawing something, maybe you have some conceptual knowledge that's in there. So I mean, it's really a kind of a tricky problem. I don't know if anyone else has thoughts on this.
Yeah, I think we all talked about linguistic verbal output, but as a way to tap into conceptual knowledge. And I think there is some slowly developing work showing that these approaches allow us to study knowledge in general that is also related to more visual tasks, but this is still current research that Emmanuel has collected some evidence. So it's always a question, but I definitely want to claim that we're talking about knowledge and knowledge activation and searching through knowledge and not about the language.
And one thing, kind of going back to the study that I talked about, I mean, those groups were matched on their cognitive ability, so their general intelligence, their fluid intelligence, and their vocabulary knowledge. And the artists in the sample were visual artists, as I had mentioned. So there might be some confound or considerations when it comes to vocabulary knowledge, but in that particular study, we kind of tried to match on that.
Yeah, usually we try to control for vocabulary size and these kind of things.
Mm-hmm.
I have a question for you, Ed. Do you think the multi-layer networks can help with controlling for lexical richness or these kind of things?
Probably yes, but that's a research to be done.
Okay.
In principle, we can overlay conceptual, visual representation of the same words and see all that. This is a way to try and capture, to convey different signals of information. So yeah, in principle, yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks.